Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Dan.
What are we chatting about this week?
Been reading a lot about layoffs and it being a tough job market, so thought we'd talk about getting a job in today's work environment, work-life balance, and when it makes sense to leave a salaried position and potentially start your own business.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, yeah, all the career things. It'll be a fun conversation. I'll kick us off. What do we want to talk about first?
I want to talk about the work environment and getting a job. So I did a presentation yesterday at Front Range Community College here in Longmont, and I talk about career opportunities in financial planning and just finance in general. And one of the larger concerns from a lot of the students is, I'm putting my resume out there for these internships or for entry-level job positions, and I'm getting no traction. I don't know if it's an issue with the resumes themselves, with the students, who I believe are very bright, or maybe they're just making poor decisions in terms of majors or what they're applying to. So I think, first and foremost, I guess what majors are and aren't, good investments for future job opportunities.
That's a good question. I think the end answer is always going to be it depends on what your objective is for your education. So in that context, it's an interesting question because, for example, like I have a bachelor's of history and political science. I can say now, having gotten a bachelor's of history and political science, that functionally I probably could have just read all the history books and all the political science books without paying for tuition and going to school for it. But, those degrees at the time were meaningful to me in my time in the military and, I thought was going to be more important to my career path. I think the issue that arises is a lot of people study what they're interested in, but they don't necessarily think about the career prospects that follow that area of interest. This isn't everybody. And I think it becomes a challenge because a lot of times you study what you're interested in and then you try to go find a job and you don't want to work in the thing you're interested in necessarily, or you want to get into a field that your area of interest for study is not really conducive to. So it's not to say that any major is or isn't worth it, but just recognizing that obtaining a degree is a signal, and sometimes it's not a very strong signal for the things you want to accomplish with it.
All right, so let me rephrase this a little bit then. If you're going to make a formal investment in education or an investment in your education, whether that's a 4-year college, master's, trade school, what makes it worth it?
So I think there's two good theories for kind of the topic of formal education. In that sense, one's going to be human capital theory, one is going to be signaling theory, which I just touched on slightly there a moment ago. Human capital theory essentially says that individuals and actually their families, your parents, are willing to make investments and utilize financial capital early on in your life to obtain greater lifetime income potential. This is where you then see statistics like the return on college being something like $2 million over a lifetime relative to just being a high school graduate. I think in that sense, the key thing there is that there are kind of top tier schools that are worth over investing in, and then there's a lot of overpriced mid tier schools, and then there's some really great bargain schools out there. So if you're going to get into, let's say, electronic engineering and you want to really be at the top of your field, then it's worth spending extra money to go to a place like MIT. If you want to get into the startup ecosystem, or AI or software ecosystem, if you can get into a place like Stanford, obviously there's a lot of pedigree behind it. It's worth overpaying, as it were, to go to a place like that. But I think it's a poor investment to, let's say, live here in Colorado and say that you want to go to Alabama to study English. Right? You can overpay for an out-of-state school, or you can overpay for a private school. So it's really important to be really economical about it, because at the end of the day, though college is an experience and education is this whole thing that we sort of often build our early life identities around, it is a meaningful investment that you're making, and it's important to think about maximizing the return on that investment. In the signaling theory context, essentially it's just that everybody's utilizing signals. Employers utilize the signals of things like experience and formal education, where you went to school, what you studied, that sort of thing, to indicate that you are more qualified or you're going to be more efficient or more effective in generating utility in the position that you apply to. And students, career changers, people seeking positions use employer signals like salary, benefits, even sometimes location or brand to ascertain whether they think it'll be a good opportunity for them personally.
All right, so let's make a hypothetical example of, let's say you're an accounting major. So probably something you don't need to go to Harvard to get, more of a broad major. And you're 6 months out from graduation. What should you be doing?
I mean, let's even zoom a little bit further back. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in planning for school is really failing to, I expect or understand that they are competing for their job from day one. So if somebody's already, 6 months from graduation, which, I was in this bucket for undergrad, I was in this bucket for grad school too. I think it's a huge mistake to be waiting until 6 months prior to graduation to figure out what you're going to do. If you are in that position, right, you want to apply aggressively, network aggressively, try to get involved in the societies, the clubs, the organizations related to the field or the profession that you want to be involved in. Try to get your name and your face out there as much as possible. But also, be thorough. There's sort of this issue right now where you hear stories about people, sending out 200 applications and hearing nothing back. I'll use what's going to probably be a terrible golf analogy, right? It doesn't matter if you take 200 practice swings on the driving range if your club is nowhere within arm's reach of the ball, right? Like it is a meaningful thing that you actually have to make contact with the thing. So it's not just about hitting submit 200 times. It's about doing it in a slow, methodical, and deliberate way to improve the quality of your application and therefore the probability that you are actually going to get past the application stage.
You've had considerably worse golf analogies, so I'll allow that one. But let's talk about that for a second, right? It's almost a quality over quantity type of thing here. We're currently, we have an application where people are sending in applications for a position we're going to be interviewing for here soon. How has the experience been with people sending in cover letters and resumes there?
We're about a day into the opportunity being out there, a little bit less than a day, actually. We've gotten 44 applications, of which right now I think 5 actually are adequate applications. The 39 or so that are not applicant or not adequate, they are submitting resumes without cover letters, even though our job posting specifically says to submit cover letters. They are applying for a financial planning or financial analyst position in something like an accounting firm or a big institutional firm, as opposed to a personal finance firm. And their resume or whatever they've submitted clearly indicates that they do not even realize they've applied for a personal financial planning job, not a corporate finance FP&A type of job. And then by extension from that, even amongst some of the people who are reading enough to realize they need to do a cover letter, I am just seeing I hate to say the laziest mistakes. We've had somebody call the firm My Wealth Managers. I've had somebody write their cover letter to Dr. Daniel Euchre, with a J and a umlaut U. I've had people just have basic typos. So there's this thing where, again, I understand that when you're applying to jobs, it sort of feels like a volume game, but understanding that it doesn't really matter how much volume you send out there if everything you send out there is not worthy of really being considered. So that's sort of my advice there as we think about the context of even how we're hiring is slow down. Right? Take the time to do it right. You can get in the door somewhere by playing the volume game, but it's a lot of work to play the volume game. And it's not to say it's not a lot of work to go for a qualitative approach either, but just recognizing that if you're actually serious about wanting competitive opportunities, you have to actually put in the work. It's not enough to just rubber stamp as aggressively and quickly as you can.
All right, well, I hope the next 44 are of better quality and maybe someone's listening here that's going to be applying and takes note here.
Yeah, I'll just give the spoilers tip here. If you apply to the position and you did not read the job posting word for word, you're not going to end up getting an interview. I will just tell you that right now, because there's a very obvious set of instructions in the job description that tell you exactly what you need to do to get past the application phase. And so far, we're batting, 5 of 44 have actually read the instructions.
Common sense isn't all that common, I guess.
It is a rare commodity, it seems.
All right, well, what about somebody out of college, right? Maybe you're a career changer or simply somebody who's not looking for their first job out of college. Are there anything that sticks out that they should be doing to boost their, you know, ability to get the resume to the top of the pile and get interviews for new jobs here?
It's an interesting thing because it sort of comes back to the same advice I give for that person who's only 6 months out from graduating. It's one thing to be visible and effective and efficient and good in your own organization, but the problem is only your organization can see that, and everybody outside has no idea whether you are or are not good at your job, or whether you're an active, engaged employee, or whether you're just sort of cruising and coasting. It's something where, again, I come back to, there's doing well at your work. So if you are a student, it's doing well at school. If you're already in the workforce, it's doing well at your job. But there's nothing wrong with having a social media presence, being part of the Financial Planning Association or the American Dental Association, like whatever's appropriate for your particular field, and being an active volunteer and going to conferences and whatnot. It's ideal if your job encourages and supports you doing those things. But it is something to just say, like, people talk about having a personal brand, and most people don't take that very seriously or like do that as an actively engaged thing. But there's people out there right now who, if we got an application from them, I would say, thank you all other candidates for your interest. We're hiring this person. I know this person. This person is great. I have absolutely no questions or qualms about their qualifications, their capabilities. And I only have that through their engagement in places like Financial Planning Association or NAPA and so on. So it's a meaningful thing to manage your career not only within your existing organization and institution, but to also kind of manage your career in the context of your greater professional community.
I think another helpful thing that is worth mentioning is when I worked for my last firm, there was a period of time where I was still new and ignorant enough that I thought I'd be there forever. But one of the things I continued to do while I was there was update my resume. Whenever I took on a new task or did something for a consistent amount of time, I made note of it while I was still working there. And it was fresh in my head and I knew what I was doing, as opposed to when I'm actually looking for a job and maybe rushing to get the resume in place and in good order. So I think for anybody out there, whether you think you're going to stay where you are forever or you're not even looking for a new job, just take note of all the roles and responsibilities and maybe even the little things that you do that you don't get recognition for, because there will become a period in time which you want to document those things in a more formal setting. And it's really hard to remember them all, when you actually do need the resume to be updated and you need to start sending it out there.
I mean, that's terrific advice. It's even terrific advice outside the context of the resume, but just kind of keeping a, what I've done well list, even at work, can be super helpful. It's actually something I was taught when I was in the Army is often, you have what are called NCOERs or OERs, and maybe there's a new name for them, but these are evaluations for non-commissioned officers and for officers. And the suggestion that I got multiple times during my career in the Army is like, essentially just fill out your own OER or your own NCOER as much as you possibly can with everything you've done, everything you've accomplished, all of your work, etc. Every time anybody ever gave you an attaboy. And then when it comes time for review season, just give it to your reviewer and be like, here you go. Here is my eval. I wrote it for you. If you want to rubber stamp it because you agree with everything I said, then we both win. So it's something to say that, even when it comes to quarterly reviews, annual reviews, however your current job does it, just keeping a list of accomplishments, I think, is a really valuable activity on top of what you suggested, right? Which is, keeping the resume sharp.
Yeah. All right. So last question here, AI. So whether it's in the classroom or maybe to help you with a resume or to get a job, should you be using, AI, or let's just call it ChatGPT, to kind of help you in any fashion for some of these opportunities?
Ooh, tough question. AI, I like to think of as the typewriter or as the personal computer or as the cell phone. It's just the next decade's super exciting technology. So it's not going anywhere. It's not going away. We will all be using AI for the rest of our lives. That said, be really, really careful about two things. Number one, be careful about AI's capability in due diligence. It's great at synthesizing data, but it's often bad about noticing certain details that are important. Hint, hint, for people applying to our position, AI is not going to catch certain things in that job posting, and it is going to get you put in the rejects list if you trust it. Second thing that goes into that as well is being mindful that, the problem with AI compared to cell phones, compared to the internet, compared to typewriters, personal computers, all of that in the past, is that AI is capable of creating something that approximates a demonstration of knowledge, right? You could not use a typewriter to fake knowing something in the past. You could not use a personal computer to fake knowing something in the past, except for just like plagiarism or ripping off other people's work. And I highlight that because I think right now a lot of people are falling into the trap of AI being super efficient and starting to use it as a replacement for their own knowledge and understanding. And the problem is, if you are then deprived of AI, or if AI is wrong, you do not have the knowledge or the professional or educated judgment to ascertain where it is right or where it is wrong. So in the context then of something like schoolwork or resumes, applications, whatever, AI is a great tool for helping you study, helping you learn, helping you synthesize your own thoughts and so on. But if you use it too much as a crutch, then it becomes a problem because you will, choke in something like an in-person interview because you've been just letting AI answer all the questions for you going up to that point, and suddenly you have no answers because you don't actually know anything. So just be really careful about using AI as a replacement for your own knowledge and your own understanding. It's a great tool like many tools before it, but it is not a flawless tool, and it's easy to make it too much of a crutch at your own peril.
Look, it's a complement to learning or everything else. It's not a replacement. So like even for me, right, like I use it sometimes to help study for my CFP, right? So a good example is I'm reading a lot of textbook material, and there's times that there'll be a full page and a half of information, and I'm like, okay, that's so technical and so dense, and I'll ask AI and say, can you dumb this down to the third grade level? And then once I understand it there, I kind of use that to apply it back to what's in the textbook. And, it kind of helps me, get the simplest version of what the concept is. And then from there, kind of learn some of the more intricate details about it. But that is not me taking a chapter and saying, hey, can you summarize this for me? There's a big difference there. And I think it's not a replacement, but it can be a complement in certain settings. But, like everything else, you don't want to become reliant on it. One day if it goes down or you can't use it anymore for whatever reason, if you find yourself no longer able to do your job, that's a problem.
Yeah. And I think functionally, again, it's still this new technology. It's this new thing. I think we will start to see a better bifurcation as time goes on. But I do think a lot of people right now are sort of punch drunk on what AI can do for them and are sort of starting to run into a problem with not being able to do their own thinking.
All right. So there was this article by the Wall Street Journal recently that came out essentially called "Work-Life Balance Will Keep You Mediocre. For financial freedom by age 30, optimize ruthlessly during your peak physical and cognitive years." And rightfully so, this stirred up a ton of debate on social media, especially Twitter. And I want to talk about it because on the one side, the math doesn't lie, right? The earlier you start, the earlier you can make more money, the more options you give yourself later in life as those investments and returns start to compound. And on the other side, life is not optimized through just numbers, right? It's not lived on a spreadsheet. Wealth is built in more ways than simply just numbers increasing. It's built in relationships and the experiences we have in our life. So it's difficult to kind of walk the tightrope between working ruthlessly and trying to live your life. So I guess to start, when we say front loading your career, does this mean working 24/7 in your 20s and 30s? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, the current vogue that you're reading about or hearing about a lot right now is something called 996, which is working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And that's sort of percolating around like the Silicon Valley ecosystem, the venture capital, private equity system. It honestly just smacks a lot of the same grind set mentality sort of stuff that you kind of saw in pre-COVID. I don't know that it's actually that necessary. I'm also very skeptical when they say obtaining financial freedom by your 30s. I'm really particularly skeptical about that. And I'm in my 30s and I have financial freedom in so much as I want it these days. But the reason I'm skeptical is because I think for the vast majority of people, obtaining something like total financial independence by your 30s requires either a pathological obsession with something like FIRE, saving 80% of your income, so that way you can effectively save several years worth of your spending level within a period of just a couple of years. Or it requires some really high risk Hail Mary bets. And when you're young is sort of the time you can afford to take those risks. But when you hear about people who have genuine financial independence, by their late 20s, their early 30s, they're either influencers, people who got big on social media. They are sometimes niche professionals, people who worked in sales or finance, who made really crazy predictions and just sort of crushed it, and suddenly made one big trade or something and helped them walk away with $1 million bonus when they were 25 or something like that. Or they are entrepreneurs, and all these are very high risk activities. And so I think it's interesting because this idea that you got to really just obsess about work and productivity and creating value presupposes a effort entered equals outcome result. And though I'd think, to take the Thomas Jefferson statement of, the harder I work, the luckier I am sort of thing, well, I can agree with that. And as a basic premise, I think there's a positive relationship between how much we work and the outcomes we kind of attain. I don't know that I think it's a meaningful thing that people need to just burden themselves, down to their absolute foundations to be successful in life.
Well, it's also interesting because I think it's easier said for people who maybe have a business, right? Who have ultimate control over what they're doing. But if you work a 9 to 5 in your 20s, sure, you can work extra hard and double the amount of time to somebody else. But to a certain extent, you're only going to get promoted, within reason at a company, right?
Well, and that that creates, I think, a incentive structure around what sometimes is described as surfing in your career, which is not to try to climb your ladder in a linear, tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 way, but essentially go from tier 1 at your company to tier 2 at another company to tier 3 at another company. Trying to make a pivot or a move every 2 to 3 years. I think you see this a lot in, for example, the tech space, where longevity is not particularly well rewarded, particularly in the technical roles. Like being a senior developer, you don't tend to get promoted from junior developer to senior developer. You go from 80 to 140 to 200 in a 3 to 5 year period. But it's not uncommon for somebody to put in their 2 or 3 years somewhere, build up their skills to go from junior to kind of full developer at somebody else's company, and then spend 2 to 3 years there, and then start to apply for senior positions at another company. So it's something where yes, you can grind it out and put in 60, 70, 80 hour weeks, but I think to some extent, again, that conflates time spent with the outcome. And I think in that particular regard, if somebody wants to be super productive at their company, that's terrific, but you have to understand the company may not need a more advanced version of you. You might be experienced, you might be advanced, you might be great at your job, but if the company's revenues or organizational structure or anything else does not support your ambitions, then you're going to run into a ceiling there. And it doesn't really matter how much you push on that ceiling, it's only going to rise so quickly for you based on the needs of the organization rather than your personal timeline.
I think that's really, really smart there. I think, you can consciously make a decision to live for work, work to live. But do we have to, make a decision here, or can we have our cake and kind of eat it too? Is there a way where we can live a lovely life and also, put ourselves considerably ahead of our peers by working really hard in our 20s and 30s?
I think it's where you sort of get the work smart, not hard thing, and not to say that you can't work hard and smart at the same time. I am always just reminded of that kind of truism that nobody's going to remember how hard you worked or how much overtime you put in except for your kids. That nobody on their deathbed says, if only I had added more shareholder value. I think it's important to balance and just not be unrealistic about how you're balancing those things, right? If you spend every afternoon, every evening, every weekend, never putting in any effort to bettering yourself, improving your human capital, improving your career prospects by volunteering, networking, being involved in the broader community, going back to school, getting a certification, getting your master's, whatever it is you need, then you shouldn't be surprised if your results are sort of mediocre. And that's not a bad thing, right? The average person is average. That is the nature of things. But in turn, right, you shouldn't hold it against the world that you didn't put in the work or put in the time to obtain a better outcome. And life's full of unfairness. There's plenty of people who put in a lot of work early on who get compounding results for the rest of their life as a result of that. There's plenty of people who take a while to kind of mature and get to that point. There's people who put in time, put a lot of work in at certain times and don't at others. There's no singular path here, but I do think it's important to recognize that life is more than work. And at the same time that, your mileage may vary regardless of how much energy and time and effort you put into it. But I know that putting in none is not going to have as great as a result as putting in some.
So if you had to, word numbers people, so like if you had to ratio it out between like the hard work versus like live your life, right? Is it like the 7 days in a week? How do you kind of measure that if you want to front load but also kind of live your life? Should it be 4 days of working more than I'm living and 3 days of living more than working, or am I overthinking it a little bit here?
I think you're not overthinking it. I think it's a bad framework, though, and I say that because I think the world is a results-oriented world. I'll point at folks like the overemployed. What do you know what I mean by that? The overemployed are typically people who work in the software occupation, right? They're developers, software engineers, something like that. They tend to work in low regulation industries. They don't work in medicine or finance or defense or something like that. But they are, something like the senior developer for, a coffee company. And then they also go and get another senior developer job at a different company. And essentially they hold down 2 or even 3 full-time jobs because what they figured out is how to be so efficient in their day-to-day work that they only actually need to put in an hour or 2 of work for each of the 3 jobs. And so they collect 3 full-time paychecks and they just don't tell anybody. Sometimes they get caught. Sometimes people get mad about it. Like there's a whole thing about this. But I like them as an inspiration, not so much for the ethics or the moral question of whether you should have multiple jobs, full-time jobs and not tell anybody. But I like them for the fact that there is a very realpolitik orientation towards getting what needs to be done and not spending time on things for the sake of spending time on things. So when you ask the question about, do you need to be like more work than play 4 days out of the week or 5 days out of the week and then more play than work? I think that's the wrong framework. I think you have to think about what is the most efficient and effective way to attain the outcomes you want. If that means doing 996, so be it. If you can be successful putting in 30 minutes a day, good for you. I don't think it's a question of time. I think it's a question of efficacy and motivation.
All right, so sounds like it's just focus more on the outputs than the inputs, I guess.
Well, and in that particular regard, again, there's all the many stories, right? A carpenter who gets hired to fix the squeaky floor and, steps on the squeaky floor and puts a nail in one particular part and hands over a bill for $100. And they say, I'm not paying you $100 for putting a nail in the floor. And so he updates it and says, nail $1, knowing where to put the nail, $99. I think there's a lot of value in the knowledge economy and the services economy as we sort of have it as our major economic drivers these days, to understanding what delivers value and creates value for yourself, for others, for your organization, for your mission, and focusing on that rather than just focusing on, well, I did show up on time and I didn't leave early, so I must have done something right.
Mm-hmm. And I know hindsight is tricky here, right? Like you'll speak to a lot of people who did front load their 20s and 30s and did make it out. It worked out well for them. They're all going to say the same thing. They're going to say it was the best thing I ever did for myself, and I wouldn't be where I am today without it. And there's some truth to that, but there's also a considerable amount of bias. I'd like to say you've done fine thus far in your career. Um, if we look at you, I guess let me ask you then, like, would you have changed anything, or do you think you leaned maybe too hard one way or the other?
It's funny because I've said before in the context of things like financial planning podcasts that this is my least favorite question because I know the outcome. So I'm going to step away from the like planning practice version of this and just sort of talk about opportunity costs. I started a business when I was 25. I am making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year now in my mid 30s. I own my practice. I don't work for anybody. I have a very great personal quality of life. I have a spouse, a wife who loves me, a great family. I have my health for the most part, not as much hair as I wish I could, but, there's some trade-offs there. Yeah, but I also have to look at that and say, like, what did I miss out on, right? Being such a driven, serious person, I've never been to an EDM rave. I never tried drugs, still haven't. I have not traveled as much as I wish I had at this point or would at this point. What personal relationships have I let sort of go by the wayside in putting, work priorities over it? So I say that all just to say, like, there's this expression that the grass is always greener on the other side, and I particularly like the amended version of that sometimes that grass is greener because it's sprinkled in bullshit. It's easy to look at people with financial accomplishments and say they must have the greatest life on earth, or they have money, they have a nice car, they have a nice house, whatever it is. But I guarantee you have things that they wish they had, whether that's better relationships, more time spent on their hobbies and interests, whether it is just having explored or had more life experiences that they never had the time or inclination to try. So it's not to say that all things are equal, but it is something I think important to recognize that just because you didn't, do the grind set thing in your 20s or 30s, just because you're not a multimillionaire by the time you're 40 or something like that, doesn't mean you've made mistakes or done anything wrong. It's just that you have had other priorities and it's your life to live.
That's really well said, Dan. Got nothing more to add there. Thanks for sharing.
Sure. And don't do drugs, kids. Or do. It's your life.
All right, well, that's a nice segue here to, leaving a salaried job to maybe do your own thing. You mentioned that you started your own business when you were 25. But, when it comes to making this shift or decision, I think a lot of time, we think about it as, oh, Joe Schmo down the street was selling candy bars when he was 12. He was always meant to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's not entirely always the case, right? People start businesses for a multitude of reasons and circumstances in their life. Are there certain qualities you think lead you to believe someone maybe is destined to be an entrepreneur or a business owner as opposed to an employee?
I honestly don't believe in any of that, past is predicate to destiny sort of thinking when it comes to entrepreneurs. I know entrepreneurs who are the most quiet, introverted, not outgoing people ever, who are just incredible thinkers or incredible builders, who are, capable of putting in the work and are able to just build a community around them of professionals who can do the other things. I know some people who were born to sell, as it were, who are not successful in business because even though they can sell anything to anybody, they don't know how to deliver. So I don't really get into this whole if you were raised doing lemonade stands or washing cars or mowing lawns or in the neighborhood or something that you're going to be a successful entrepreneur. I was not entrepreneurially inclined growing up. My parents were also not very supportive of it. I remember 2 or 3 times trying a thing here or there to make more money and kind of not getting scolded for it, but them not really being really on board with it. And in total fairness, these were things like getting paid to deliver mail from the mailbox to my parents. So these are not like great business ideas by any means, but I think there's the notion that at the end of the day, some people are just born entrepreneurs and some are not. I think there are plenty of genetic and life upbringing, family, et cetera, advantages that can help or hinder you, as it may be. But I don't really buy into you have to have had this big drive to be an entrepreneur. I think a lot of people become entrepreneurs on accident, or because of happenstance, as opposed to because they were born to be the CEO one day.
Okay. I completely agree with that. I think there's lots of folks out there who do lemonade stands as kids. Don't think that necessarily makes them lovely entrepreneurs. But let's talk about that for a sec. You said that a lot of people who end up starting their own thing do so by happenstance. What do you mean by that?
I think when I look, particularly, I like to look at clients for this. A lot of our clients who are entrepreneurs who have been very successful as entrepreneurs started just doing their thing on their own. It's like they were just a software developer who started helping people with some projects, or they just started making a particular product or good, or providing a service more so as like a hobby or an interest, or somebody said, hey, I'll just give you some money if you can help me with this. And then they were good at it, or they're great at it, and they enjoy doing it. And so they kept doing it, and then people kept getting interested in it. So it's sort of this thing where they were excellent at a thing. They never intended to start a business in any serious sense, but then people just kept wanting them to do it. If you go back to a book like The E-Myth, there's the example of the pie maker, and the pie maker, makes great pies, and then they keep making pies, and everybody wants more pies, and eventually they have to hire somebody just to handle the selling of the pies, and they have to hire people to help them make more pies, and eventually they own a pie company as opposed to making pies. I think there's a lot of pie makers out there who, through demand for their excellence, find themselves being entrepreneurs without meaning to.
That being said, right, these clients or people that continue to maybe do their own thing, I'd assume there are certain qualities that they have, or at least the ones that do it successfully have, right? So whether it's the ability to, feel comfortable in a land of uncertainty, or, maybe the grit to figure things out when there's nobody to ask for help. I guess that there are overlaps that you tend to see in these folks.
Solution orientation is probably the number one thing that I see. A lot of people are problem people, and they're great at being problem people. They can tell you exactly what's wrong. They can tell you all the issues with all the solutions they've already thought of, and why they're not going to work, or why bad outcomes are going to happen. If they go route A versus route B versus route C, they can tell you all the problems, but they do not try to overcome problems. They're just great at walking up and saying, like, well, that's wrong, or that's broken, or that's not going to work. And again, the world needs those people, right? Like they are great actuaries, for example. But entrepreneurs have to be solutions oriented. It's sort of that, necessity is the mother of invention thing. Entrepreneurs have to have this constant focus on what is going to create the best outcome. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be optimal, but what is going to get us past this hurdle so we can get ready to surmount the next hurdle. And so whether they're an individual, whether they're a manager, whether they're in a big team, small team, doesn't matter. They have this constant focus on, okay, how do we get to the next thing? How do we overcome this? As opposed to a, woe is me, the world is terrible. There are all these problems out here, and somebody needs to solve these for me.
Out of curiosity, being solutions oriented, as you say, right, to a big quality that you need to be successful in this entrepreneurial journey. Do you think that's a skill set and mindset you can develop, or you think it's kind of something that's innate?
I think it's developable. I think certain experiences lend themselves to it. I think the biggest place there is more that you can try to develop it on your own, but I think it's something that can be nurtured really effectively, right? It's working at a job where instead of just being told, make no decisions on your own, ask every time, we will make the decisions for you. I think that is the type of environment that does not lend itself to developing that skill. But in jobs where you are essentially sort of always being groomed for the next step of your career, where it's, hey, Daniel, you have never dealt with this type of trust, but rather than me just telling you how that trust works, why don't you research it? Why don't you work on it? Why don't you come and tell me how you think it should work? And then if you figure it out correctly, then I'll say good job. And if you get 90% of the way there, I'll make some corrections. But I'm going to let you struggle with the problem and try to solve the problem rather than just telling you how to do it every single time. I think that's the sort of environment where it's very helpful to have that kind of nurturing component. But not everybody gets that, that opportunity, right? If you go work at a big box retail store, there's a way they want things done, and it's going to be hard for you to get that experience. I think if your job is not conducive to it, then another great place to work on that is just through things like volunteer activities, right? If you volunteer to a nonprofit or organization, often they are, I don't want to say poorly run. That's not quite the inference I want to make here, but they're small. They don't have a lot of resources. There's not a lot of standardizations or systems. And so often they're very open to creative problem solving. And that can be a really great place to have a positive impact and sort of stretch those muscles, as it were.
I think that's really good, because there's probably some people listening that do want to stretch those muscles a little bit, but maybe don't feel they're getting it in their current work environment. And I mean, me and you can both speak firsthand to the nonprofit volunteer roles and maybe the lack of organization or the creativity that you can bring to a position because there's a limited structure and continuity in terms of who's there and what you're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, everything is a practice. Nobody's perfect at anything. There are just people who have more experience and more practice. And so if it's something that you feel like you don't have it today, great, go seek opportunities to develop it if that's something you want.
Are there other, shifts that when you go from an employee to an employer or a business owner that one has to make, in addition to just being a self-starter and solutions-oriented? Are there other things that people are going to have to consider and think about?
The self-starter one is something you're sort of glossing over a little bit, but I actually think it's a really critical thing. When you go from being an employee to being an entrepreneur, you are time rich and cash poor. And effectively, you need to trade as much time as possible for what is going to ultimately generate the revenue that's going to keep the lights on. Everybody has a different amount of runway when they start a business. Some people have a little, some people have a lot, some people have more runway being built for them by a spouse or an inheritance or a family member or a sponsor or something like that. But ultimately, I think that one of the easiest traps to fall into is perfectionism, right? Just like building and building and building and building your product, your service, your platform, whatever it is, and never getting to the rubber meets the road part of trying to introduce that product, platform, service, whatever it is, to a customer or to a client. And instead just sort of expecting if I build the perfect widget, the universe will just understand that I have created that widget and the universe will demand that widget. And the truth of the matter is, you have to spend as much time as possible on building the community, building the interest in the widget, just as much as you do actually having a deliverable.
Oh, we'll even take financial services for an example, right? If you go out on your own, you can make the perfect website, have the perfect fee model, make a great blog and all these lovely things. If you don't figure out a way to get clients, it doesn't really matter all that much that your website's beautiful and you have all these great headshots and designs, right? You need to keep the lights on. You do that by actually delivering on the product or service that you're seeking to provide, right?
Yeah, I mean, even getting like the website in place, the blog or whatever is in place is great. I think a lot of entrepreneurs fall prey to death by spreadsheet, which is not even the public facing part of it, but it's just like this back ends operations. Like if I build the perfect spreadsheet, somehow the numbers that are represented in that spreadsheet will come to life. And the spreadsheet's just math, it's just tracking, it's just organization. You ultimately still have to put your foot on the bike pedal to move the bike forward. And that's the same thing in any entrepreneurial activity versus an employment environment, right? If you're hourly, if you're salaried, you will continue to get paid even if you don't do anything, so long as you don't do things to such an extent that you get fired for it. In the world of entrepreneurship, nothing happens on its own unless you have created some sort of spark or something to get an ignition going to create that force and that momentum.
Do you think some of that is not nearly ignorance, but it's more fear-based, right? Like I'm going to keep tinkering and make this thing perfect almost to avoid doing the hard thing, which is going out and, putting your name out there, building visibility and getting clients?
I think it's less fear. I mean, I think fear can certainly be a factor, but I think you actually said the more key word here, which is avoidance, right? It's sort of the same thing. It's like, I want to get fit. I want to get muscular. I want to get skinny. I want to look good in the mirror, whatever it is. I know that to do that, all I have to do is eat the right things and exercise sufficiently. Like that is a logical thing pretty much everybody knows and understands implicitly. But there is a substantial difference between knowing that you need to do that and getting in the car or getting on the bike or walking out the door to go to the gym, right? Buying the right things at the grocery stores, not drinking the second beer, all the various things that go into that. I think in entrepreneurship, avoidance becomes the thing, right? It's one thing to say, I've got a great idea, a great piece of technology, a great solution for a problem. It's another thing to really take the steps in earnest to bring those things to the market, to face rejection, to face criticism, to expose yourself to the possibility, right? The real possibility, and this is where fear plays into it, but the real possibility that you are wrong or that what you have is not good or that there is no demand for the thing, no matter how important you think it is.
Do you think the thing, product, service, because you decide to go out on your own has to be unique, right? Like I think a lot of people, when they go out on their own, they think, well, it has to be different than the norm or whatever everybody else is doing. Can you just provide something that's already, in the marketplace, but just you doing it as opposed to somebody else? And that is the differentiator maybe in and of itself.
I don't know that the you factor matters that much, except in like the most niche cases. Like if you're a model, then yeah, like you are you are differentiated by definition as a model or as an actor or, something like that. I think in the context where you're asking it, though, it really just becomes a question of like, what is the saturation of that thing? What is the meaningfulness of that thing? Like here in Longmont, there's 136, 137 licensed financial services professionals who have a brokered license or an investment advisor license or some combination thereof. And there were more when I started a decade ago. There's a few less these days. But in that context, you could have said like, well, damn, there's like 140, 150 people already doing what you do or what you think you're going to do here in Longmont. Surely there's no room for you to be here. And so it was necessary to be different. It was necessary to be a financial planner, not just an insurance salesperson or an investment broker or something like that. It was necessary to become a fee-only practitioner. It was necessary to become a CFP professional, right? All these things that were differentiating. I think a blue ocean is a lot more conducive to the just because you're doing it versus being super differentiated. But there's also plenty of problems in the universe that everybody agrees are problems that somebody could make a good living solving, right? I'll point in the financial services world. There are no good platforms for SEP or simple IRAs. There just aren't. There's no money in them, or nobody's figured out a way to make decent money on them. And so nobody spent money building a great platform for them. But there's 101 great 401k startup platforms. So it's just this thing where, blue oceans exist even in what seem like saturated marketplaces. So it's not so much about just, hey, I'm doing it and I am super different just because I'm a different person. It's about being willing to lean into a thing that seems like it's well served and really identifying where the weak points are and going ahead and trying to deliver a solution in that particular area.
That's well said. I'll ask it again, and your answer might just be similar. But you are a business owner, right? And I guess looking back on yourself as an entrepreneur, are there things maybe you would have done differently, or do you think you even would be an entrepreneur maybe if you had taken a different route in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the same. Knowing the results, it's hard to say that I would, if only because it worked out just fine. It's interesting, though. I think what I'll comment on there is that it's easy to look at success and find that to be, sort of valuable in of itself. A colleague out in Arizona sent me a picture of their business partner's desk the other day, and at first I didn't get why. And then I realized our benefits guide had been printed out and was on their desk. And I said, like, oh, I see you have that. They said, like, yeah, we think it's like a best practice. Like, we think what you've written, what you've created there, how you've done it is the best possible version of that. And like, that's super flattering. But I literally have just spent, a couple hours in the last 2 weeks making updates and changes to it. Like, I don't think it's perfect. And so in that same context, I think it's easy to look at the outcomes. And I know I've talked a lot about outcomes over effort during this whole conversation, but I think it's easy to look at the outcomes and say that's sufficient. There's nothing that could be better. And another question here is, what would you do differently? I don't know that I would have done anything the exact same way, because I now know a better way to do a lot of things. It's just hard to understand how that would have affected or changed things in the present. Would we be better off? Would we be worse off? Would we have made it? Would we have not have? I don't know. There's also that element of, it's easy to look at something that didn't work out and say, well, since it didn't work out, I wish I hadn't done that, right? Like, you have a relationship, you date for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then you break up. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, that didn't work out, so I shouldn't have done it. But I think there's a lot to be learned even from having done things the wrong way. So I'll come back to the core of your question. I can point at a lot of things and say, like, that wasn't a good idea. I wish I'd done that differently. But I don't know that fundamentally, given the choice or the chance, that I actually would have gone about things differently. So it's hard to say.
All right. Hey, well, you've exhausted my questions here. Is there anything else you want to add?
Only my own question, which is, of course, Daniel, in the course of the last week since you were on the podcast, what is it that you've learned that you think our audience would benefit from hearing?
We had a client come in earlier this week, and he made an interesting comment. He said that I come in here every single quarter, and I ask you a couple of the same questions, and you give me the same answer, which, when I say it like that, almost sounds like a bad thing. But he was saying it in a positive light. He's like, it's very beneficial for me to continue to hear you relay the same message and have the same belief in this thing, whether it's the investment strategy or philosophy or our take on the economy or the market. And he's like, yeah, it's really beneficial for me to just continue hearing that message in a slightly different tone or in a slightly different way every single time I come in here. And I think that's a lot of the value we provide is like, people sway in their beliefs or they question if this thing is still working, right? And it's important for us to hold firm and have the confidence in what we're doing and then be able to relay that message to clients and kind of make them feel good about the current course of action and instill those beliefs in them so that by the 5th time they've heard it, they know what we're going to say and they feel good about it.
The consistent compounding of positive behaviors aggregates to a much greater result than you'd think.
There you go. Yeah, that's what I said.
Succinctly. Few words. Well, thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. See you next week.
Looking forward to it. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.